The 911 call came in at 11:52 p.m. There's been a miracle on Highway 95. The caller was crying, his voice shaking as he tried to explain what he'd just witnessed. Police found David Thompson's car wrapped around an oak tree, completely totaled, but David was standing 20 feet away without a scratch, claiming a man in robes had pulled him to safety. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the police radio with the kind of urgency that made seasoned officers sit up straight. Unit 47, we have a code 7 on Interstate 95, mile marker 127, single vehicle accident with possible fatalities. Caller reports, unusual circumstances. Officer Maria Santos had been patrolling Virginia's highways for 12 years, and she'd never heard dispatch use the phrase unusual circumstances for a drunk driving accident. She pressed the accelerator of her patrol car, the speedometer climbing past 80 miles per hour as she raced through the October night toward what would become the most inexplicable case of her career. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 hours, turning the asphalt into a mirror that reflected the scattered headlights of late-night travelers. It was the kind of weather that made driving dangerous for sober people, let alone someone like David Thompson, who at that very moment was gripping the steering wheel of his 2018 Honda Accord with hands that shook from more than just the cold. David Thompson was 42 years old, though he looked closer to 50 after the brutal year he'd endured. His once athletic frame had grown soft around the middle, his brown hair was thinning at the crown, and his blue eyes, which his ex-wife Sarah used to say sparkled with mischief, now held nothing but defeat. 3 hours earlier, he had walked out of Murphy's Tavern in Richmond after consuming what the bartender would later tell police was at least 6 beers and 3 shots of whiskey. But David had stopped counting after the 4th drink, somewhere around the time he'd decided that maybe it would be better if he just never made it home at all. The speedometer on David's dashboard read 87 miles per hour, and climbing. His vision was doubling, the white lines on the highway blurring into dizzy patterns that made his stomach lurch. He knew he was drunk. He knew he was driving too fast. He knew that at any moment he could kill himself or, worse, kill some innocent family just trying to get home. But for the first time in months, David Thompson simply didn't care. It had been exactly 47 days since Sarah had served him with divorce papers. 47 days since she'd looked him in the eye and said, "I can't watch you destroy yourself anymore, David. I won't let you destroy us too." It had been 31 days since his boss at Commonwealth Insurance had called him into the corner office and explained that his recent performance issues meant they were restructuring his position. And it had been exactly 12 hours since he'd received the phone call from his brother Mark, telling him that their mother, the one person who still believed David could turn his life around, had suffered a massive stroke and wasn't expected to survive the night. The Honda's engine roared as David pressed harder on the accelerator. The speedometer needle swung past 90 miles per hour. In his drunken state, he felt like he was flying, like the car was barely touching the ground. The rational part of his mind, the part that wasn't drowning in alcohol and grief, screamed at him to slow down, to pull over, to call someone for help. But that voice was getting quieter with each passing mile, drowned out by the sound of rain on the windshield, and the voice in his head that kept repeating the same 3 words, "What's the point?" 20 miles behind David, Officer Santos was pushing her patrol car to its limits, racing to reach the accident scene. She'd been a cop long enough to recognize the signs: single vehicle, late night, unusual circumstances. It usually meant drugs, alcohol, or someone having a mental health crisis, sometimes all 3. She'd worked dozens of these calls over the years, and too many of them ended with her standing in the rain, waiting for the coroner to arrive while some family got the worst phone call of their lives. But something felt different about this one. The caller, a truck driver named Bobby Martinez, who'd been hauling freight from Miami to Boston, had been almost incoherent when he'd dialed 911. Through his tears and broken English, he'd managed to convey that he'd witnessed something that wasn't possible, something that had shaken his faith in everything he thought he knew about the world. When pressed for details by the dispatcher, all Bobby could say was, "The car should have exploded. The man should be dead." But someone was there. David's hands were cramping from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. His knuckles were white, his forearms ached, and his vision was getting worse by the minute. The alcohol in his system was doing more than just impairing his motor skills, it was amplifying every emotion, every regret, every moment of self-hatred he'd accumulated over the past year. As the speedometer hit 93 miles per hour, David found himself thinking about his wedding day 15 years ago, about the look of pure joy on Sarah's face as they danced to their song at the reception. He thought about the house they'd bought in the suburbs of Richmond, about the nursery they'd painted yellow because they wanted to be surprised. He thought about the 3 miscarriages that had slowly invisibly begun to tear their marriage apart, and about how he'd dealt with each loss by drinking a little more, working a little less, caring a little less about everything that mattered. The rain was coming down harder now, and David's windshield wipers were struggling to keep up. The road ahead was a blur of water and reflected light, and he realized with detached clarity that he could no longer distinguish between the white lines of the highway and the optical illusions created by his intoxicated brain. He was driving blind at nearly 95 miles per hour, and for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, this seemed appropriate. His entire life had been driving blind for months now, stumbling from one disaster to the next without any clear sense of direction or purpose. In the distance, David could see the red taillights of another vehicle, probably a semi-truck based on its height and the pattern of its lights. He was gaining on it fast, too fast, and somewhere in the fog of alcohol and despair, he realized he needed to make a decision. He could slow down, try to regain control of his vehicle, and live to face another day of unemployment, divorce proceedings, and hospital visits to see his dying mother. Or he could close his eyes, let go of the steering wheel, and let whatever was going to happen just happen. David chose option 2. At 11:47 p.m., on a rain-soaked stretch of Interstate 95 in rural Virginia, David Thompson released his grip on the steering wheel of his Honda Accord and closed his eyes. The car was traveling at 94 miles per hour when it began to drift left toward the median barrier. According to the physics of automotive accidents, David had approximately 4.7 seconds before his vehicle would impact the concrete barrier at an angle that would send it spinning back across 3 lanes of traffic, potentially striking the semi-truck that Bobby Martinez was driving north toward Richmond. But physics, as David was about to learn, sometimes bends to accommodate miracles. Officer Santos was still 15 miles away when she saw the explosion light up the night sky ahead of her. It was a brief orange flash that painted the low-hanging clouds in shades of amber and red, the kind of light that meant twisted metal, spilled gasoline, and lives changed forever. She radioed dispatch to request emergency medical services and prepared herself mentally for what she was about to find. In 12 years of police work, she'd arrived at the scene of 43 fatal automobile accidents, and she never got used to the silence that followed the chaos, the way the night always seemed to hold its breath in the presence of sudden death. What Officer Santos found when she arrived at mile marker 127 defied every law of physics, medicine, and common sense she'd ever learned. David Thompson's 2018 Honda Accord was wrapped around a massive oak tree like aluminum foil around a baseball bat. The impact had been so severe that the engine block had been driven back into the passenger compartment, the roof had collapsed completely, and every piece of safety glass in the vehicle had been reduced to glittering fragments scattered across 50 yards of highway. The car had obviously been traveling at enormous speed when it left the roadway, launched itself over a drainage ditch, and collided with the oak tree with sufficient force to embed the trunk nearly 2 feet into what had once been the vehicle's interior. No one could have survived that crash. The physics were impossible. The human body simply couldn't withstand the G-forces involved in a 90+ mph collision with an immovable object. Officer Santos had seen crashes with half that impact velocity that had resulted in fatalities, and this wreckage looked like something you'd find after a small plane crash, not a car accident. But standing 20 feet away from the demolished Honda, completely uninjured and apparently unshaken, was David Thompson himself. He was wearing the same clothes he'd put on that morning, a blue button-down shirt that should have been soaked in blood, khaki pants that should have been torn to shreds, and brown leather shoes that should have been somewhere inside the twisted wreckage of his car. Instead, David looked like he'd just stepped out of his house to check the mail, not a scratch on him. Not a drop of blood, not even a wrinkle in his clothing. "Sir?" Officer Santos called out as she approached, her hand instinctively resting on her service weapon. In her experience, people who survived impossible accidents were often in shock, sometimes violently so. "Sir? Are you injured?" Do you need medical attention? David turned to face her, and Officer Santos was struck by two things immediately. First, despite having just walked away from a crash that should have killed him instantly, David Thompson didn't smell like alcohol. Second, his eyes were completely clear, focused, and filled with something she couldn't quite identify. It wasn't shock or confusion, or even relief. It was something that looked almost like wonder. Officer David said, and his voice was steady, calm, completely coherent. I need to tell you what happened here. I need you to understand that what you're seeing isn't possible, but it happened anyway. Bobby Martinez, the truck driver who'd called 911, was sitting in the cab of his 18-wheeler, chain-smoking cigarettes with hands that shook so badly he could barely hold his lighter. When Officer Santos approached his truck to get his statement, Bobby could barely form coherent sentences. I seen the car coming up behind me, driving crazy fast, Bobby told her, his accent thick with emotion and adrenaline. Had to be doing 90 maybe more. Rain was coming down hard, and this guy was all over the road, weaving back and forth like he was drunk, or having a seizure or something. I got on my radio to warn other drivers, told them to watch out for this crazy white car that was gonna kill somebody. Bobby paused to take another drag from his cigarette, and Officer Santos noticed that his hands were trembling. Then I seen him drift toward the median. Car was going so fast, officer, so damn fast. And I'm thinking, this is it, this is how some poor bastard dies on a Tuesday night in October. But then, Bobby shook his head, as if he still couldn't believe what he was about to say. Then I seen someone else in the car.
Someone else? Officer Santos flipped to a fresh page in her notepad. You saw a passenger? No, ma'am. I seen someone else get in the car. Right there in the driver's seat next to the guy who was driving. Happened so fast I almost thought I imagined it. But I swear on my mother's grave there was suddenly another person in that car. A man in white clothes with long dark hair, and this man he reached over and grabbed the steering wheel. Officer Santos had investigated hundreds of accidents, and she'd heard all kinds of stories from witnesses who'd been traumatized by what they'd seen. Sometimes people's minds filled in details that weren't there, invented explanations for things that were too horrible to accept. But Bobby Martinez seemed completely sincere. And more importantly, his story matched the impossible evidence she was looking at. What happened next? She asked. The car went off the road just like physics says it should, hit that tree doing probably 90 miles an hour. Should have been a fireball, officer. Should have been pieces of metal and human beings scattered all over this highway. But instead of an explosion, there was just this light. What kind of light? Bobby stubbed out his cigarette and immediately lit another one. Bright. Brighter than anything I ever seen, but it didn't hurt to look at it. Lasted maybe 3 seconds, and when it faded, the car was wrapped around that tree like you see it now, and the driver was standing right where you found him. Completely fine. Not a scratch on him. And the other man, the one in white. Bobby met her eyes, and Officer Santos could see that he was completely serious. Gone. Just gone. Like he was never there at all. As Officer Santos walked back toward David Thompson, who was still standing calmly beside the wreckage of what should have been his coffin, she found herself struggling with concepts that had no place in a police report. She'd been trained to deal with facts, evidence, physical reality, but nothing about this scene made sense according to any version of reality she understood. The emergency medical technicians had arrived and were checking David's vital signs despite his insistence that he was completely uninjured. His blood pressure was normal. His pulse was steady, his pupils were responsive, his blood oxygen levels were perfect, and most mysteriously, when they administered a breathalyzer test, it read 0.00, zero blood alcohol content, despite the fact that 3 witnesses at Murphy's Tavern would later swear that David Thompson had consumed enough alcohol to kill a horse. Mr. Thompson, Officer Santos said, approaching him with her notepad ready. I need you to tell me exactly what happened here tonight. David looked at her with those clear, wonder-filled eyes and said, Officer, I was driving drunk. I was going way too fast, and I made a decision to let go of the steering wheel and let whatever was going to happen just happen. I wanted to die tonight. I was ready to die tonight. But you didn't die. No, David said, and a smile played at the corners of his mouth. I didn't die. Someone else had different plans. The witness says he saw another person in your car, a man in white clothing. Can you tell me about that? David was quiet for a long moment, looking at the wreckage of his Honda as if he still couldn't quite believe he'd walked away from it. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a quiet certainty that made Officer Santos believe every word. His name was Jesus, David said simply, and he saved my life in more ways than one. Officer Santos had been expecting a lot of possible explanations for what had happened on Interstate 95 that night. Mechanical failure, medical emergency, even some kind of elaborate insurance fraud. But she hadn't been expecting this. Jesus, she repeated, writing it down in her notepad because that was what police officers did, even when nothing made sense. I know how that sounds, David continued. I know you probably think I'm in shock or having some kind of breakdown. But I'm completely lucid, officer. I've never been more clear-headed in my life. When I let go of that steering wheel, when I closed my eyes and decided I was done fighting, he appeared in my passenger seat. Long dark hair, kind eyes, wearing simple white clothes, and he said my name. He said your name. He said, David, is this really how you want your story to end? And then he reached over, put his hands on the steering wheel, and pulled us both to safety. Officer Santos looked at the demolished car, then back at David Thompson, who should have been a stain on the highway, but instead looked like he'd just received the best news of his life. Mr. Thompson, I have to ask this for my report. Have you been taking any medications tonight? Any drugs besides alcohol? Nothing, David said. Just beer and whiskey, and apparently not even that according to your breathalyzer test. That was true. Somehow impossibly, David Thompson was stone cold sober despite multiple witnesses who'd seen him drinking heavily just hours before. The EMTs had run the test 3 times, convinced their equipment was malfunctioning, but the result was always the same, 0.00 blood alcohol content. Officer Santos, David said, and something in his tone made her look up from her notepad. I know you're trying to make sense of this, and I know it doesn't fit into any category you've ever dealt with before. But sometimes things happen that can't be explained by science or procedure or common sense. Sometimes miracles just happen, and the only thing you can do is witness them and be grateful. As if to underscore David's point, the rain suddenly stopped. Not gradually, not with the natural tapering off that usually marked the end of a storm, but all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. The clouds began to part, revealing patches of star-filled sky, and a full moon cast silver light across the accident scene. I need you to come with me to the hospital, Officer Santos said finally. Even if you feel fine, you need to be examined after an accident like this, and then we're going to need a full statement. Of course, David agreed, but officer, when you write up your report, please include everything I told you about what happened in that car. I know it sounds impossible, but it's the truth. And maybe, somewhere down the line, someone else who's ready to give up will read it and realize that there's always hope, even when there seems to be none. As the tow truck arrived to remove what was left of David Thompson's Honda Accord, Officer Santos found herself thinking about her grandmother, who'd raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 8 years old. Grandma Rosa had been a deeply religious woman who'd insisted that angels walked among us every day, protecting and guiding us through the worst moments of our lives. Officer Santos had always thought those were beautiful stories, the kind of thing that helped people cope with tragedy and uncertainty. But standing there on Interstate 95, looking at a man who should have been dead, talking to witnesses who'd seen impossible things, trying to write a police report about an event that violated every law of physics she knew, Officer Santos found herself wondering if maybe Grandma Rosa had been right all along. David Thompson climbed into the back of the ambulance for what would turn out to be the most unnecessary hospital visit in Virginia medical history. Every test would come back normal, every scan would show perfect health, every examination would reveal no evidence whatsoever that he'd just survived a crash that should have been instantly fatal. But as the ambulance pulled away from the scene, David pressed his face to the small rear window and looked back at the wreckage of his car. For just a moment, in the moonlight filtering through the broken clouds, he could swear he saw a figure standing beside the oak tree. A man in white clothing with long dark hair, watching the ambulance disappear into the night, with the kind of smile that spoke of plans fulfilled and promises kept. The figure was gone in the blink of an eye, but David wasn't surprised. He was learning that miracles by their very nature tended to be fleeting things. What mattered wasn't whether you could prove they'd happened, but whether you were wise enough to recognize them when they appeared in your life, and brave enough to let them change you. As the ambulance carried him toward Richmond General Hospital, David Thompson began to plan the rest of his life. He had phone calls to make, apologies to offer, and amends to attempt. He had a marriage to try to save, and a mother to visit in the hospital. He had a drinking problem to face, and a job to find, and 1,000 small ways to prove that the miracle he'd experienced hadn't been wasted on him. But first he had a story to tell. A story about a night when physics bent to accommodate grace, when death stepped aside to make room for redemption, and when a man who'd given up on everything learned that sometimes, just sometimes, everything refuses to give up on you. The story of what happened on Interstate 95 that night would spread far beyond the pages of Officer Santos' police report. It would be told in hospital waiting rooms and church services, in AA meetings and family gatherings, in all the places where people gather to share the moments when ordinary life reveals its extraordinary possibilities. And David Thompson, who'd started that evening as a broken man ready to end his story, discovered that sometimes the most beautiful chapters are the ones that begin with the words, "I thought it was over, but then something impossible happened."
Richmond General Hospital had seen its share of miracle recoveries over the decades. But what walked through the emergency room doors at 1:23 a.m. on that October night would become the subject of medical conferences for years to come. David Thompson sat on the examination table in Trauma Bay 7, submitting to his fourth round of tests while Dr. Elizabeth Martinez struggled to reconcile what her instruments were telling her with what the police report claimed had happened. "Mr. Thompson, Dr. Martinez said, reviewing his latest CT scan results on her tablet, "I need you to understand how extraordinary this is. According to the accident report, you were in a single-vehicle collision at approximately 90 miles per hour. Your car was completely destroyed. But these scans show no evidence of trauma whatsoever. No internal bleeding, no broken bones, no concussion, no whiplash, not even soft tissue damage." David nodded patiently. He'd been trying to explain the unexplainable for the past 2 hours, first to Officer Santos, then to the paramedics, and now to a succession of increasingly baffled medical professionals. "Doctor, I understand why this doesn't make medical sense. But sometimes things happen that go beyond medical science." Dr. Martinez had been an emergency room physician for 15 years. She'd seen car accident victims who'd been thrown from vehicles and walked away with minor bruises. She'd treated people who'd survived crashes that should have been fatal due to lucky angles of impact or the protection of modern safety equipment. But she'd never seen someone emerge completely unscathed from the kind of wreckage that had been described to her. "The blood tests are what really concern me," she continued, pulling up David's lab results. "When you arrived, the EMTs reported that you'd been drinking heavily earlier in the evening. Multiple witnesses confirmed this. But your blood alcohol level is 0. Not just below the legal limit, actually 0. That's medically impossible if you'd been drinking as recently as 3 hours ago." "I know," David said simply. "Mr. Thompson, alcohol doesn't just disappear from your bloodstream instantaneously. The human liver processes alcohol at a fixed rate of approximately 1 drink per hour. If you'd consumed what the witnesses described, your blood alcohol level should still be well above 0.15, maybe even 0.20, but it's reading 0. David looked at Dr. Martinez with the same calm certainty he'd shown Officer Santos. "Doctor, what if I told you that everything about my physical condition changed in the moment of that crash? What if something happened that reset everything, the alcohol in my system, the injuries I should have sustained, even the trajectory my life was supposed to take?" Dr. Martinez set down her tablet and studied David's face. In 15 years of emergency medicine, she'd learned to read people quickly and accurately. She could spot drug seekers, insurance fraudsters, and attention seekers from across a crowded waiting room. But David Thompson didn't fit any of those categories. He seemed genuinely mystified by his own condition, grateful rather than entitled, and completely coherent despite the trauma he'd supposedly experienced. "Tell me exactly what you remember from the moment of impact," she said. David closed his eyes, and for the first time since arriving at the hospital, his expression changed. The calm certainty remained, but it was joined by something deeper, a sense of wonder so profound that it transformed his entire face. "I remember letting go of the steering wheel," he began. "I remember thinking that I was ready for everything to be over. I was drunk, I was driving too fast, and I made a conscious decision to just let whatever was going to happen happen. I closed my eyes and waited to die. But you didn't lose consciousness. No, that's what's so strange. I was completely aware of everything that happened next. I felt the car leave the road. I felt it going airborne. I knew we were about to hit that tree, and I knew it was going to kill me. But right before impact, someone else got into the car with me." Dr. Martinez had heard crash victims describe all kinds of hallucinations and near-death experiences. The human brain did strange things when faced with mortal trauma, often creating elaborate visions as a way of coping with the impossible. But something about David's tone made her keep listening. "This person," she said carefully, "can you describe them?" "He was about my age, maybe a little younger, long dark hair, kind eyes. He was wearing simple white clothes, like robes maybe, but modern somehow. And when he looked at me, I felt like he could see everything, every mistake I'd ever made, every moment I'd failed the people I loved, every reason I had for wanting to give up. But instead of judgment, all I saw in his face was compassion." David opened his eyes and looked directly at Dr. Martinez. "He said my name. He said, 'David, is this really how you want your story to end?' And then he reached over and put his hands on mine, on the steering wheel. I felt this incredible sense of peace, like everything was going to be okay no matter what happened next. And then we hit the tree. But it wasn't like hitting something solid, it was like—" David paused, searching for words to describe the indescribable. "It was like hitting water, or mist or light. There was no impact, no sound, no pain. Just this bright, warm light that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And when the light faded, I was standing beside my car, completely unharmed, and he was gone." Dr. Martinez made notes on David's chart, though she wasn't sure what to write. "Thompson, have you ever experienced hallucinations before? Do you have any history of mental health issues?" "Nothing like that," David replied. "And doctor, I know how this sounds. I know you're trained to look for medical explanations, psychological causes, anything that fits into the categories you understand. But what if some things just can't be categorized?" Before Dr. Martinez could respond, there was a knock on the trauma bay door. Officer Santos entered, looking even more perplexed than she had at the accident scene. "Dr. Martinez, I need to speak with Mr. Thompson about some additional information we've received." "More witnesses?" David asked. In a way, Officer Santos consulted her notepad. "We've had 3 more people call the station in the past hour. All of them were driving on I-95 tonight, and all of them reported seeing unusual lights in the area where your accident occurred." "What kind of lights?" Dr. Martinez asked, her scientific curiosity overriding her professional skepticism. "That's the strange part," Officer Santos continued. "They all described the same thing, a bright, warm light that appeared suddenly around 11:47 p.m., lasted for several seconds, and then faded. But here's what's really interesting. 2 of the callers said they were feeling suicidal before they saw the light, and both said that seeing it somehow changed their minds about ending their lives." David sat up straighter on the examination table. "They felt suicidal. One was a woman driving home from her husband's funeral. She said she'd been planning to drive her car into the Potomac River, but when she saw that light, she suddenly felt like there was still hope for her future. The other was a teenager who'd been fighting with his parents, and was planning to take his father's gun when he got home. He said the light filled him with a sense of peace he'd never experienced before." Dr. Martinez looked back and forth between David and Officer Santos, trying to process information that challenged everything she thought she knew about cause and effect, science and faith, the possible and the impossible. "There's something else," Officer Santos added. "We ran a background check on you, Mr. Thompson, standard procedure for accident investigations, and we found something unusual." "What kind of unusual?" "You've been reported missing by your wife. She filed the report about 4 hours ago, after you didn't come home from the hospital where your mother is staying. She was worried that in your grief and impaired condition, you might do something harmful to yourself." David felt his chest tighten. Sarah had been worried about him. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite the divorce papers and the angry words and the months of watching him slowly destroy himself, she still cared enough to worry when he didn't come home.
"She's here," Officer Santos continued. "In the waiting room. She's been here since we called to tell her about the accident. When we explained that you were completely uninjured, she didn't believe us. She insisted on coming to see for herself." "She's here?" David's voice cracked slightly. "She's here, and she's not alone. Your brother Mark is with her, and so is Father Rodriguez from St. Mary's Catholic Church. Apparently your wife called them when she couldn't reach you earlier tonight."
Dr. Martinez watched David's face transform as Officer Santos delivered this news. The calm certainty remained, but it was joined now by something that looked like hope mixed with terror. The expression of a man who'd been given a second chance, and wasn't sure he deserved it. "Doctor," David said quietly, "would it be possible for me to see them? I know I'm still technically a patient, but, Mr. Thompson, medically speaking, there's no reason to keep you here any longer. All your tests have come back normal, more than normal actually. You're in perfect health. But I do want to schedule some follow-up appointments, and I'd like you to consider speaking with one of our counselors about the trauma you've experienced. The trauma of surviving something impossible." Dr. Martinez smiled for the first time since David had arrived. "The trauma of having your entire worldview challenged in the space of a few seconds. That's not something most people can process easily, even when it's a positive experience." As Dr. Martinez prepared David's discharge paperwork, Officer Santos stepped outside to call Sarah Thompson into the examination room. Through the small window in the trauma bay door, David could see his wife pacing in the hallway, her face pale with worry and exhaustion. She was wearing the same blue sweater she'd had on when she'd served him with divorce papers 6 weeks ago, but her expression was completely different now. Instead of resigned anger, he saw fear and hope warring in her features. When Sarah entered the trauma bay and saw David sitting on the examination table, completely intact and apparently unharmed, she stopped dead in her tracks. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sarah began to cry, not the bitter tears of frustration she'd shed so many times over the past year, but tears of relief so profound they seemed to come from her soul. "David," she whispered, and the way she said his name reminded him of their wedding day, of the early years when they'd believed their love could survive anything. "Sarah, I'm sorry," David said, standing up and taking a step toward her. "I'm sorry for everything. For tonight, for this year, for all the ways I've let you down and hurt you and made you feel like you had to choose between saving me and saving yourself." Sarah looked at him carefully, studying his face as if she were seeing him clearly for the first time in months. "David, you look different. Your eyes are clear. You don't smell like alcohol. You don't look like someone who was just in a car accident. A lot of things changed tonight, Sarah. Things I can't fully explain, but things I hope you'll let me try to show you through how I live from now on." Mark Thompson entered the trauma bay then, followed by Father Rodriguez, an elderly priest with kind eyes and calloused hands, who'd known the Thompson family for over a decade. Mark looked exactly like an older version of David, but where David's face now held peace and wonder, Mark's showed nothing but confusion and concern. "Little brother," Mark said, using the nickname he'd called David since childhood, "what the hell happened out there? The police said your car looked like it had been hit by a train, but you're standing here without a scratch. Something impossible happened, Mark. Something that's going to sound crazy when I tell you about it, but something that saved my life in more ways than one." Father Rodriguez stepped forward, his weathered face gentle with concern. "David, your wife called me tonight because she was worried about your state of mind. She thought you might need someone to talk to, someone to help you process whatever you've been going through. But looking at you now, you seem peaceful, more at peace than I've seen you in years. Father, I need to tell you all something, and I need you to listen with open hearts, even though it's going to challenge everything you think you know about what's possible in this world." David looked around the small trauma bay at the faces of the people who loved him most: his wife who'd been ready to divorce him to protect herself from his self-destruction, his brother, who'd watched him spiral downward for months, and the priest who'd baptized him as an infant and married him to Sarah 8 years ago. "Tonight I got into my car planning never to come home again. I drove drunk, I drove recklessly, and when I was about to crash, I let go of the steering wheel and closed my eyes because I was ready to die. But someone else had different plans." David told them about the figure who'd appeared in his passenger seat, about the impossible conversation, about the crash that should have killed him, but instead filled him with light, and left him standing unharmed beside the wreckage of his car. He told them about the witnesses who'd seen things that couldn't be explained, about the medical tests that showed no trace of alcohol or injury, about the other drivers who'd reported experiencing hope and peace at the exact moment of his accident. When he finished, the trauma bay was completely silent, except for the distant sounds of hospital activity in the corridor outside. "David," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "you're telling us that Jesus Christ appeared in your car tonight and saved your life. I'm telling you that someone who called himself Jesus appeared in my car tonight and saved my life. Whether you believe that was actually Jesus or some kind of guardian angel or a manifestation of divine intervention or just my subconscious mind finding a way to save me from myself, that's up to you. What I know for certain is that I'm alive when I should be dead, I'm sober when I should be drunk, and I'm filled with hope when I should be filled with despair." Father Rodriguez had been listening with the expression of a man who'd spent his entire adult life thinking about the intersection of faith and reality, of miracles and everyday life. "David," he said carefully, "in 40 years of ministry, I've heard many people claim to have experienced divine intervention. Most of the time these experiences can be explained by coincidence, or psychology, or the natural human tendency to find meaning in random events. But occasionally, very occasionally, I encounter something that simply can't be explained by anything other than grace." "And what do you think this is?" David asked. Father Rodriguez smiled. "I think this is a man who was given a second chance, and whether that chance came from God or from his own inner strength, or from the mysterious workings of a universe that sometimes bends toward mercy, the important thing is what he does with it." Dr. Martinez returned to the trauma bay with David's discharge paperwork, and stopped short when she saw the small crowd gathered around her patient. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize we had so many visitors. Mr. Thompson, you're free to go whenever you're ready. All your tests came back normal, though I still recommend follow-up care and counseling." "Doctor," Sarah said, "can you tell me honestly, is it medically possible for someone to survive the kind of accident my husband was in without any injuries at all?" Dr. Martinez considered her answer carefully. "Mrs. Thompson, in 15 years of emergency medicine, I've learned that the human body is capable of surviving things that should be impossible, and sometimes it fails to survive things that should be minor. What happened to your husband tonight falls into the category of medical anomaly. I can't explain it scientifically, but I can confirm that he's in perfect health. And the blood alcohol level, also medically anomalous. Based on witness reports of his alcohol consumption earlier this evening, his blood should still show significant impairment, but his system is completely clear." As David signed his discharge papers, he felt a presence he was beginning to recognize, a sense of warmth and peace that seemed to emanate from somewhere just beyond his peripheral vision. He looked around the trauma bay, but saw only his family, the doctor, and Officer Santos. Still the feeling persisted, like a gentle hand on his shoulder, reminding him that he wasn't facing his second chance alone. "There's one more thing," Officer Santos said as they prepared to leave. "The accident report. I need to know how you want me to file this. I can write it up as a standard single-vehicle accident with unexplained survival, or I can include your full account of what you experienced. But if I include the full account, it's going to raise questions that I can't answer." David looked at Sarah, at Mark, at Father Rodriguez. "Include everything. Every detail I told you. Every witness statement about unusual lights. Every medical anomaly. Let people read it and decide for themselves what they think happened. But don't let them dismiss it just because it doesn't fit into their understanding of how the world works. You realize this report is going to become public record," Officer Santos warned. "It might attract attention you don't want, media, curiosity seekers, people who want to debunk your story, or exploit it for their own purposes." "I understand," David said, "but if my story can give hope to even one person who's ready to give up, then whatever attention or criticism comes with it is worth it." As they left Richmond General Hospital, and walked into the early morning air, David felt like he was seeing the world with new eyes. The parking lot looked different, not just because dawn was breaking over the Virginia sky, but because everything seemed somehow more vivid, more real, more precious than it had before. The sound of traffic in the distance, the smell of autumn in the air, the feeling of Sarah's hand tentatively taking his, as they walked toward Mark's car, all of it felt like a gift he'd never expected to receive. "David," Sarah said as they reached the parking lot, "I need you to understand something. What happened tonight, whatever happened tonight, doesn't automatically fix everything that's been wrong between us. You still have a drinking problem, you still need to find a job, we still have a lot of work to do if we're going to save our marriage." "I know," David replied. "And I know I don't have the right to ask you to believe that everything's different just because I say it is. All I can ask is that you give me the chance to prove it through how I live from now on." Sarah studied his face in the pale morning light. "You really do look different," she said wonderingly. "Not just sober, actually different, like you've been carrying something heavy for a long time, and someone finally helped you set it down." "That's exactly what it feels like," David agreed. Mark started his car, and turned to look at his brother in the back seat. "So what happens now? Where do we go from here?" David thought about the question as they pulled out of the hospital parking lot. Where did someone go after experiencing a miracle?
How did someone live a normal life after being touched by the impossible? First we go see Mom, David said. I need to tell her what happened, and I need to ask her to forgive me for all the ways I've disappointed her over the past year. David, Mark said gently, you know the doctors don't expect her to regain consciousness. The stroke was massive. I know what the doctors expect, but I also know that sometimes the impossible happens, and even if she can't respond, she needs to hear me say I'm sorry, and that I love her, and that I'm not going to waste the second chance I've been given. Sarah squeezed David's hand. After we visit your mother, then what? Then I call my sponsor from AA, the one I stopped returning calls to 3 months ago. Then I start looking for a new job. Then I ask you if you'll consider going to marriage counseling with me. Then I take it one day at a time and try to become the man I was supposed to be before I lost my way. As Mark drove through the quiet streets of Richmond in the early morning light, David found himself thinking about the figure who'd appeared in his car, the man with kind eyes who'd asked if this was really how he wanted his story to end. The truth was, David's story wasn't ending at all. It was just beginning a new chapter, one that started with the words, I thought I was lost forever, but then someone found me, and showed me the way home. The sun was fully up by the time they reached Richmond Memorial Hospital, where David's mother lay in the intensive care unit, surrounded by machines that monitored the fading rhythms of her life. David had been dreading this visit for 12 hours, ever since Mark's phone call had delivered the devastating news about their mother's stroke. But now, walking through the hospital corridors with his family beside him, David felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the strength to face whatever came next, secure in the knowledge that he wouldn't have to face it alone. What David Thompson discovered in his mother's hospital room would challenge his understanding of miracles once again and set the stage for a transformation that would ripple outward from one family to touch an entire community. But that part of the story was just beginning, and like all the best stories, it would unfold one impossible moment at a time.
The intensive care unit at Richmond Memorial Hospital was a place where families came to say goodbye. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, casting a pale glow over the maze of medical equipment that kept the most fragile patients tethered to life. Room 314 had been David Thompson's mother's home for the past 18 hours, since the massive stroke had left her unconscious and barely breathing. Margaret Thompson was 74 years old, a retired elementary school teacher who dedicated her life to nurturing other people's children after her own husband died young, leaving her to raise David and Mark alone. She was the kind of woman who sent handwritten birthday cards to every former student she could track down, who volunteered at the food bank every Wednesday, and who'd never stopped believing that her youngest son would find his way back from the darkness that had consumed him over the past year. David stood in the doorway of room 314, looking at his mother's still form surrounded by the quiet symphony of medical machines. She looked smaller than he remembered, fragile in a way that broke his heart. Her gray hair was spread across the pillow like silver threads, and her face, which had always been so animated with laughter and concern and unconditional love, was peaceful but terrifyingly quiet. The doctors say she can probably hear us, Mark said softly, standing beside David. Even though she can't respond. Sarah took David's hand and squeezed it gently. Take all the time you need. David approached his mother's bedside and pulled up the visitor's chair. He sat down and took her hand in both of his, surprised by how cold it felt, how thin and fragile her fingers seemed. Hi Mom, he said quietly, his voice already thick with emotion. I'm sorry I wasn't here when this happened. I'm sorry I've been such a disappointment to you over the past year. I'm sorry you had to worry about me on top of everything else you've been dealing with. He paused, looking at her face for any sign that she could hear him. The monitors continued their steady beeping, the ventilator continued its rhythmic breathing, but there was no indication that Margaret Thompson was aware of her son's presence. I need to tell you what happened to me tonight, Mom. I need you to know that all those prayers you've been saying for me, all that faith you've had when everyone else gave up, it wasn't wasted. David's voice broke slightly. Someone heard you. Someone answered. Over the next 20 minutes, David told his unconscious mother the entire story of his encounter on Interstate 95. He described his despair, his decision to end his life, the mysterious figure who'd appeared in his car, and the impossible survival that had brought him to her bedside instead of to the morgue. Sarah, Mark, and Father Rodriguez listened from the corner of the room, but David spoke as if he and his mother were alone in the world. He told me his name was Jesus, Mom. And you know what? I believed him. Not just because of the miracle, but because of the way he looked at me, with the same unconditional love I used to see in your eyes when I was a kid, and I'd done something wrong. He saw all my mistakes, all my failures, all the ways I'd let everybody down, and he loved me anyway. David squeezed his mother's hand, and for a moment he thought he felt the slightest pressure in return, but it was so subtle he couldn't be sure if it was real or just wishful thinking. I promise you, Mom, I'm not going to waste this second chance. I'm going to get sober. I'm going to save my marriage. I'm going to find a way to make you proud again. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the miracle I received tonight. The room fell silent except for the mechanical sounds of the life support equipment. David sat holding his mother's hand, trying to memorize the feeling of her skin against his, knowing that these might be their final moments together. Then something extraordinary happened. Margaret Thompson's eyes opened, not gradually, not with the confused flutter of someone emerging from deep sleep, but suddenly, and with complete clarity. Her brown eyes, the same color as David's, focused immediately on her son's face with an intensity that made everyone in the room hold their breath. "David," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the ventilator tube that had been removed just an hour earlier. "My beautiful boy, Dr. Patricia Williams," the neurologist who'd been treating Margaret Thompson, arrived in room 314, just in time to witness what she would later describe as the most medically inexplicable recovery she'd encountered in 23 years of practice. According to every test, every scan, every indicator they'd monitored for the past 18 hours, Margaret Thompson should have been in an irreversible coma with massive brain damage. The stroke had been devastating, affecting multiple areas of her brain responsible for consciousness, motor function, and speech. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Williams said, approaching the bed with the cautious excitement of a scientist witnessing something that challenged everything she understood about neurology. "Can you tell me your name?" "Margaret Elizabeth Thompson," came the clear reply. "And this is my son David, who looks like he's seen a ghost." "Mom," David said, tears streaming down his face, "how do you feel? Are you in pain?" Margaret smiled, and it was the same radiant smile David remembered from his childhood, full of warmth and mischief and infinite love. "I feel wonderful, honey. Better than I've felt in years." "And David, I heard everything you told me about tonight." "Every word, Dr. Williams was frantically checking Margaret's vital signs, reviewing the monitor readings, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what medical science told her should be possible. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to run some tests. What you're experiencing shouldn't be happening. The damage from your stroke was extensive. You should have significant cognitive impairment, speech probably paralysis on your left side." Margaret Thompson sat up in bed with no assistance and flexed her fingers with perfect dexterity. "Doctor, I think you're about to learn the same lesson my son learned tonight. Sometimes things happen that can't be explained by medical science or any other kind of science. Sometimes miracles just happen." "Mom," Mark said, his voice filled with wonder, "do you remember what happened? Do you remember having the stroke?" "I remember feeling dizzy during dinner, and then I remember falling. But after that," Margaret paused, and her expression became distant, as if she were recalling something beautiful and impossible. "After that, I found myself in the most beautiful place I've ever seen. There were gardens everywhere, and light that didn't come from any sun I've ever known, and music that seemed to come from the very air itself." "A near-death experience," Dr. Williams murmured, making notes on Margaret's chart. "Many patients report vivid dreams or visions during periods of unconsciousness." "It wasn't a dream, doctor," Margaret said gently, "and I wasn't alone there. I met someone, a man with kind eyes, who told me about my son's accident tonight. He said David had been given a second chance, and he asked if I wanted to stay in that beautiful place or come back to help David learn how to use his second chance wisely." David felt the same presence he'd experienced in his car, the same warmth and peace that had surrounded him during the impossible crash. Looking around the hospital room, he could swear he saw a figure standing in the corner, the same man with long dark hair and compassionate eyes, who'd saved his life on Interstate 95. "Mom," David said quietly, "what did you tell him?" Margaret reached over and touched her son's face with fingers that should have been paralyzed. "I told him that my job as your mother wasn't finished yet. I told him I needed to come back to see you become the man I always knew you could be." Over the next 3 hours, Dr. Williams ran every neurological test available at Richmond Memorial Hospital. Margaret Thompson's brain scans showed no evidence of stroke damage. Her cognitive function was perfect, her motor skills were completely normal, her speech was clear and coherent. According to every medical indicator, she was in better health than most people her age, who'd never experienced any kind of neurological event. "This is impossible," Dr. Williams told the Thompson family, as they gathered in the consultation room adjacent to Margaret's new regular hospital room. "I've been a neurologist for over 2 decades, and I've never seen anything like this." The initial scans clearly showed massive stroke damage. The follow-up scans show a completely healthy brain. It's as if the stroke never happened, or as if it was healed, Father Rodriguez suggested quietly. Dr. Williams looked at the priest with the expression of a scientist whose worldview was being systematically dismantled. "Father, I'm not a religious person. I believe in evidence, in data, in things that can be measured and verified. But what I'm seeing here challenges everything I thought I knew about brain trauma and recovery." "Sometimes," Father Rodriguez replied, "God uses medical professionals as instruments of healing. And sometimes he works directly, without any medical intervention at all. The important thing isn't understanding how the miracle happened, but recognizing it as a gift and using it wisely." As the Thompson family left the hospital that afternoon, David carried with him the discharge papers for both himself and his mother, 2 people who should have been in intensive care or the morgue, now walking out into the sunshine of a perfect October day. Margaret insisted on walking to the parking lot without assistance, and David noticed that she moved with the easy grace of someone half her age. "David," Margaret said as they reached Mark's car, "I need you to understand something about what happened to us tonight. We weren't just saved from death, we were given a mission." "What kind of mission?" "To tell people that miracles still happen. To help people understand that no matter how lost they feel, no matter how hopeless their situation seems, there's always the possibility of redemption, of healing, of starting over." Sarah, who had been mostly quiet during the long day at the hospital, spoke up. "Mrs. Thompson, are you saying David and you are supposed to become some kind of evangelists?" Margaret laughed, the same musical laugh David remembered from his childhood. "Oh honey, I'm not talking about preaching on street corners or starting a religious movement. I'm talking about living our lives in a way that demonstrates hope. I'm talking about David getting sober and staying sober, not just for himself, but as proof that people can change. I'm talking about you 2 working on your marriage, and showing other couples that love can survive even the worst times." Over the following weeks, word of the Thompson family miracles spread throughout Richmond in the way that extraordinary stories always do, quietly at first, through family and friends, then more widely as people who'd heard the account felt compelled to share it with others. Officer Santos's police report became legendary within the Virginia State Police, copied and forwarded until nearly every law enforcement officer in the state had read about the impossible accident on Interstate 95. Dr. Martinez at Richmond General began presenting David's case at medical conferences, not as a religious testimony, but as an example of medical anomalies that challenged current understanding of trauma survival. Dr. Williams did the same with Margaret's case, contributing to a growing body of research into spontaneous neurological recovery that had neurologists across the country scratching their heads. But the most profound changes weren't happening in medical journals or police files. They were happening in the lives of ordinary people who heard the Thompson family story and found hope for their own impossible situations. Linda Rodriguez, the widow who'd been planning to drive into the Potomac River the same night as David's accident, read about the experience in a local newspaper article. She recognized the timing. Her moment of unexpected peace had occurred at exactly 11:47 p.m. on the same night. Linda canceled her suicide plans, and instead joined a grief support group at her church, where she eventually became a counselor for other people dealing with devastating loss. Tommy Mitchell, the teenager who'd been planning to use his father's gun after seeing the mysterious lights on I-95, confessed his suicidal thoughts to his parents and asked for help. He entered therapy, worked through his depression, and eventually became a peer counselor at his high school, helping other students who were struggling with mental health issues. Bobby Martinez, the truck driver who'd witnessed David's impossible survival, couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen. He began attending church regularly for the first time since childhood, and eventually felt called to become a chaplain for other long-haul truckers,
offering comfort and support to men and women who spent their lives alone on America's highways. 6 months after his accident, David Thompson celebrated his 180th day of sobriety at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting in downtown Richmond. He'd found a job as a counselor at an addiction recovery center, using his own experience with rock bottom and miraculous redemption to help others who thought their situations were hopeless. Sarah Thompson withdrew her divorce papers and began attending couples therapy with David. Their marriage wasn't magically perfect, they still had work to do, trust to rebuild, new patterns to establish. But they had something they hadn't had in years, genuine hope that their love could survive and even thrive.
Margaret Thompson returned to teaching, volunteering at an adult literacy program where she helped people who'd never learned to read as children. She never spoke directly about her miraculous recovery, but her students noticed that she had an unusual gift for believing in people who'd given up on themselves, for seeing potential in situations that seemed impossible. 1 year after the accident, the Thompson family received an invitation that surprised them all. The Richmond Police Department was hosting a community safety event, and they'd asked David to speak about the dangers of drunk driving. But instead of the typical cautionary tale about consequences and tragedy, they wanted him to tell his story of redemption and second chances. David stood at the podium in the Richmond Civic Center, looking out at an audience of several hundred people, police officers, medical professionals, families who'd been affected by drunk driving, recovering addicts, people who'd heard about his story and driven from as far away as North Carolina to hear him speak in person. A year ago, David began, "I got into my car planning never to come home again. I was drunk, I was desperate, and I was ready to end my life and potentially take innocent people with me. What happened next should be impossible, but it happened anyway, and it changed not just my life but the lives of everyone I love." For the next 45 minutes, David told his story with the same quiet honesty he'd shown Officer Santos in the trauma bay that night. He didn't try to convince anyone that what had happened was supernatural, but he also didn't apologize for believing it was. He simply shared his experience, and let people draw their own conclusions. "I can't prove to you that Jesus Christ appeared in my car that night," David said as he concluded his remarks. "I can't provide scientific evidence for the miracles my family experienced. But I can show you this, I can show you a man who was lost and is now found, who was broken and has been healed, who was hopeless and now lives in hope. Whether you call that divine intervention or the power of the human spirit or just extraordinary luck, the result is the same: lives transformed, families healed, hope restored." In the audience, Sarah and Margaret Thompson wiped tears from their eyes as they watched David speak with the confidence and peace of a man who'd been given a gift he didn't deserve, and had spent every day since trying to be worthy of it. After the presentation, dozens of people approached David to share their own stories of moments when hope had appeared in impossible circumstances, when help had arrived from unexpected sources, when they'd experienced something that couldn't be explained but had changed everything. Some were religious people who saw God's hand in every coincidence, others were skeptics who believed in science above all else, but had encountered something that challenged their assumptions. All of them had been touched by the mystery of grace in action. As the Thompson family drove home that evening, David found himself thinking about the man who'd appeared in his car that night, the figure with kind eyes who'd asked if this was really how he wanted his story to end. The truth was, David's story was far from ending. It was unfolding into something more beautiful than he'd ever imagined possible. "David," Margaret said from the passenger seat, "do you ever see him again, the man who saved you?" David considered the question as they drove through the familiar streets of Richmond. "Not the way I saw him that night. But sometimes I catch glimpses, in the eyes of someone I'm counseling who suddenly understands that recovery is possible, in Sarah's smile when she realizes our marriage really is healing, in your face when you're helping someone learn to read. I think maybe that's how miracles work. They don't just happen once and disappear, they keep happening, spreading from person to person, life to life, like ripples in a pond," Sarah added. "Exactly like ripples in a pond. One moment of impossible grace touches one life, and that life touches another, and another, until the miracle has spread further than you could ever trace or measure." That night, as David prepared for bed in the house he'd once been ready to leave forever, he offered the same prayer he'd been saying every night for the past year: "Thank you for the second chance, help me use it wisely. And if there's someone out there tonight who's where I was a year ago, ready to give up, ready to end their story, please let them know that there's always hope, even when it seems impossible." David Thompson fell asleep that night with the same sense of peace that had surrounded him in the moments after his impossible survival. He dreamed of bright lights and kind eyes and a voice that spoke his name with infinite love. When he woke the next morning, he was ready to face another day of his miracle-transformed life, knowing that the best part of his story was still being written, one day at a time, one act of grace at a time, one impossibly hopeful moment at a time. The accident report filed by Officer Maria Santos remained in the Virginia State Police archives, a testament to the night when physics bent to accommodate grace and a man who'd given up on everything learned that sometimes everything refuses to give up on you. People still read it sometimes, still wonder about the details that don't quite add up, still debate whether what happened on Interstate 95 that October night was miracle or coincidence. But for David Thompson and his family, the truth was simpler than all the debates and explanations and theories. Sometimes, when you least expect it and least deserve it, love shows up wearing the face of a stranger and reminds you that your story isn't over yet. Sometimes miracles happen not to convince skeptics or amaze believers, but simply to save one broken life and then use that saved life to bring hope to a world that desperately needs to believe in second chances. The highway signs on Interstate 95 still mark mile marker 127, where an oak tree stands with a scar in its bark from the night a miracle happened. Drivers pass it every day without knowing they're traveling over holy ground, the place where death stepped aside to make room for redemption, and where one man's worst night became the first day of his new life. And sometimes, just sometimes, other drivers claim to see unusual lights near that oak tree, lights that fill them with inexplicable peace and remind them that no matter how dark their current chapter might be, their story isn't over yet. The end. If this story touched your heart, remember that you too can be an instrument of transformation in someone else's life. Sometimes all it takes is showing up for someone who's ready to give up and reminding them that there's always hope, even when it seems impossible. Subscribe for more stories that awaken hope and remind us that miracles still happen today. Share this message with someone who needs to hear it. Comment about a time when hope appeared in your life, when you needed it most. Remember, you never know when you might be the miracle someone else is praying for.